We're going to continue on a little bit relative to nutrition. We're going to talk about the diseases that come to us by eating animal products and intensify our focus on this one particular aspect of nutrition. Some of the information will be sort of a continuation and some of it will have a little bit greater focus. If I were to put a title on this, I would say it would be Animal Diseases and Mankind. I'm going to read to you from Counsels on Diets and Foods, page 356. It says, "Let the diet reform be progressive. Let the people be taught how to prepare foods without the use of milk or butter. Tell them that the time will soon come when there will be no safety in using eggs, milk, cream, or butter because disease in animals is increasing in proportion to the increase in wickedness in men." Now, we've seen a little bit of increase in wickedness in men in our lifespans, haven't we? I think in the last 10 years we've seen an exponential jump. The time is near when, because of the iniquity of the fallen race, the whole animal creation will groan under the diseases that now curse the earth. That was in 1902. You remember the word that I used, soon? Okay, I'm quoting directly from the Spirit of Prophecy. The time will soon come when there will be no safety. Some people have what we call a preferential conviction and not a principled conviction. And they say, well, I prefer not to eat eggs, and I prefer not to drink milk, and I prefer not to eat meat, but if there's a good loaf of bread and it's got some whey in it, that's okay. You can get too fanatical over this whole thing. That's what I hear sometimes. And I see people, sometimes even people who are well entrenched in very historic independent ministry. They have this sort of an image that they have about them, and when you get close to them, you discover that they eat whatever doesn't get passed. And you just shake your head and say, Lord, where are the people who are actually going to get convicted? And people sometimes tell me, well, it's not that big of a deal, and I'm just really not convicted on that. But the question I have is, whose fault is it that they're not convicted? Is the Holy Spirit asleep? No. Or are they just sitting there with their fingers in their ears? Well, let's try and get some idea of how we have come to where we are with so many diseases in animals. And a lot of it has a lot to do with farming practices and how we have treated our animals. And it's kind of interesting how this has all occurred. Many, many years ago, in the beginning of this country, there were very few people on the face of this earth. Most of them were centered in other countries, and when you got onto the North American hemisphere, there was hardly anybody. And so we had very few animals. And so you could have your little 20 to 40 acre farm and still have very few animals per acre because you didn't require a lot of animals to make your livelihood. You might have 2 cows and about 4 horses and a few chickens and a dog and a cat, and that was the sum total of your livestock on your farm. And you probably didn't have fences. You just let them kind of ramble around. And since you didn't have any nearby neighbors, your animals had a real easy time always grazing in fresh areas. Now, if you've ever worked with animals, you'll discover that animals do not like to eat grass from where another animal or themselves have defecated or urinated in the recent months. God has placed something in their little brains to give them an instinct to have some sort of a natural aversion to being in that area to graze again until at least a year has gone by, at least a season has gone by. Well, as time has gone on, we have gotten to where we have more animals per acre and more animals per acre, and we are more and more populating the earth. The agricultural lands are shrinking, so we're having to make what land we do have produce more, so we're shoving more animals down into it, feeding them more feeds and less grazing. You look at the way poultry are raised, all jammed into little cages and can't move. You know, pigs, all the same thing. All the animals are shoved down into a feedlot type of production. What happens when you have a lot of people all in a small area to their health? It increases the amount of disease, doesn't it? When I fly in airplanes, I look around and I go, I don't want to be by all of these people this long. I walk through an airport and it's, there's people everywhere. I want to move them out, get them away from me. I had a hard time with Japan when I first got there. Very, very congested. Well, one of the things that has continued to be a very important factor in causing animal diseases has been the disease of greed in humans. You and I, we talked about this a little earlier, have been demanding low food prices in the grocery store. All humans are greedy. They do not want to pay any more than they have to. And of course, in this day and age, it may not necessarily always be just greed. We just plain can't afford what we have to go to buy in the grocery store anymore. I haven't been grocery shopping for a long time, but my wife keeps telling me that increasingly the price of produce has been skyrocketing to the point she says, what do you want us to do? Do we not eat anymore? Or are we going to have to cut somewhere else so we can keep eating? And she tells us that we could eat for less money if we didn't have as much fresh food. But I said that can't be the place we cut back. We'll have to cut back on something else. Maybe it's going to be electricity. I don't know, whatever we're going to cut back, but it's not going to be the fresh foods. Well, farmers are getting into a difficult position because we're forcing them to give us food for less money, or it's not raising the price as much. So they're learning to feed different types of feed. They're learning to inject them with hormones and antibiotics and put antibiotics in the feed to keep the animals around. And economics have demanded a low food price. And unfortunately, that means that we have had to treat the animals with far less respect and far less humanity than once we were accustomed to in this country. We've had to put increasingly elevated dosages year by year of antibiotics in the feeds to keep them from getting sick as they're placed into these feedlot situations. We now discover that many people are unable to tolerate meat or dairy products because of the pass-through antibiotics. Now, especially in the dairy industry, they check the milk for antibiotic use, but they only have tests available for 3 antibiotics. Well, farmers aren't as stupid as some people have stereotyped them. They found out immediately which of the 3 antibiotics they can check for, and those are not the ones that they are using. They use the ones that they can't get caught with, and they continue to use them in fact many times right through all the milking cycles and everything. Hormones in feeds were a tremendous blessing to the profiteer because we discovered that we could dramatically increase the amount of milk that a cow could produce during a given period of time, and the bottom line would look a little better financially from a profit standpoint. We discovered one bad thing though. When you inject the hormones into the cattle, they begin to metabolize their own proteins. So basically, we began to burn our cows up. They began to eat their own bodies from the inside out in order to produce all this milk. So the dairyman said, we've got to give them a higher protein feed, and we call that a hot feed. Well, where are we going to get our protein from? Throw a little extra soybean meal in there. It wasn't hot enough. Still burning the cows up. Your typical cow should last, in the old days, in the old farms, maybe 20 years for a cow. That's an old cow, but it was not that unheard of for a cow to produce for up to 20 years, at least into the latter teens and the mid-teens. They discovered that if they would grind up other animals and place this animal protein into the cow's feed, that they had sufficient protein in the feed that the cows would not metabolize their own body proteins and burn themselves literally up from the inside out. And so now, feed them hot feeds, give them antibiotics, give them hormones, and wow, here comes the milk. Good bottom line, good profitability. Even in spite of that, they discovered that the average dairy cow now is hardly making it past maybe 7 years at the most. Many of them are pulled out of the lineup anywhere from 4 and 5 years. I mean, you spend at least 2 years growing them up from a calf, and then you've only gotten 4 or 5 years max for productive life, and then it's time to send them off to the Golden Arches. Well, there's some downsides in this hormone use in addition to just the animals. It's increasing the early onset of puberty and adolescence. We have children who do not even reach their teens before they are reaching puberty. They're beginning to have all of these hormones turned loose in their bodies, and they're beginning to have this rush of sensual desire pulsing through their veins when they do not have brains mature enough to know how to cope with it. And so constantly we're beginning to see children who are pregnant, who are in high school and junior high school. Recently heard of a little girl 12 years old with a baby. This is a factor that causes, in my opinion, unnecessary pressures for sin. Also, we are beginning to see increasing elevations of statistical inferences of PMS and menopause complications. I believe that there may be some correlation there. Certainly be well worth looking into. The only way that we can have cows that can handle this kind of a pressure that we're putting on them, though, is to give them animal recycled food. So now we're going to recycle animals. We recycle paper and glass and tin cans and aluminum and tires, and now we're going to recycle animals. Well, what kind of animals are we going to recycle? The pick of the litter, top of the line, best animal we can find? No, we're going to recycle the dead and the dying. These feeding recycling practices are beginning to cause a lot of disease. In addition to the animals, they're recycling manure. If you went to a feedlot and asked them for a truckload of manure, they would say, "We can't afford to give it to you, it has too much food in it." We've got to recycle it for all the undigested grains out of it first, and we at least have to run it through some pigs first. Maybe we can recycle some out for the cattle, at least for the pigs, and what the pigs miss, the chickens can have. And so this is the way this type of thing goes on. The dead and the downer cattle are causing a tremendous, and not just cattle, sheep, pigs, whatever, all these dead and downer animals are creating a tremendous potential for disease. We've got situations where diseases are beginning to erupt in this country where people never thought possible. You know, when we had the mad cow thing in Europe, everybody said, well, it'll never happen in the United States. I mean, we're much too smart for that. But we already had it. There was a mink farm in Wisconsin. And this mink farm noticed that they had increasingly larger numbers of mink going crazy. Erratic physical behavior, banging around in their cages and not able to get to their water and feed. And if you've ever seen a film clip of a mad cow, they gyrating all over like they have like Parkinson's or MS or one of those diseases where the nerves and the muscles lose their coordination. And the mink were having this problem. They said, looks like we have mad mink. So they began to do some autopsy studies on these little animals and discovered they certainly did have what appeared to be the mad cow disease, except in a new species. And they said, this is incredible. This really is a spongiform encephalopathy disease, but how could it have gotten here? And everyone said, well, what do you feed them? You're feeding them ground up dead cows. Well, we don't have mad cow disease in this country. It couldn't have come from a cow. Where did it come from? So they took some mink and they ground them up and they fed them to some healthy cows. It wasn't very long and the cows had mad cow disease. So they took those mad cows, ground them up, and fed them back to healthy mink, and they had mad mink. And they said, well, we probably ought to get the hint. Let's grasp the obvious here and discover that we really do have a problem. Many, many years ago, we used to find these spongiform diseases in a certain type of people. Spongiform by meaning it turns your brain into a sponge. Your brain begins to look like modified Swiss cheese, full of holes. Probably the only actuality or virtual actuality of being an airhead. And it's not a nice thing to say, but it is really sad. There was one type of people, and those who happened to be the South Sea Island cannibals. For some reason or other, and man does not know why, it appears that when you make someone become a cannibal, this is the end result. Cannibalism in animals was no more intended by our Creator than cannibalism in human beings. Now, we've been told over and over and over that animal diseases are not a threat to humans because diseases do not cross species lines. That's what I was taught in school. I don't know if any of you can relate to that. I've always been taught that in school and all through the sciences. Animal diseases, diseases don't cross species lines. Birds keep their diseases, cats have their diseases, dogs have their diseases, cows have their diseases, and we don't worry about them. But we're beginning to find that there are two types of disease transmission potentials, and one is from what we call prion diseases and the other from retrovirus diseases. And I want to examine both of those. And the reason that I'm sharing this is not to scare you to death, but when you go into your friend's house, your neighbor's house, some contact's house, and you begin to try to share a better way of life, they say, so what's wrong with eating meat? What's wrong with drinking milk? Why is it a big problem? Now, earlier we shared from a nutritional standpoint, biochemically and from that respect. But what's the deal with this one? You as a Christian want to save them from a potential death, don't you? Isn't that responsibility? Isn't that stewardship? And if you can share this information with them, you will provide many times the proper motivation for them to make a change. You don't just share the scary information. You need to give them the entire picture showing God's plan, showing that when man steps outside of God's plans that there are consequences to pay. And just through this, perhaps you'll help them to understand that God has other plans, like plans for marriage, plans for keeping the Sabbath. Lots of different plans for dress. There's a lot of plans that God has had and man has ignored, and now the consequences are being paid. Let's talk about the prions first of all. Prions, I hesitate sometimes to talk about prions because we know so very little about them. We really do not know what they are. They have neither DNA or RNA. So how could they transmit a disease? Nobody really knows. Maybe before Jesus comes, scientists will figure this out. But at the current time, we're not really certain how that they transmit a disease. However, we do know that there are very, very emphatic correlations between prion presence and disease transmission in certain types of diseases. Our bovine spongiform encephalopathy in animals has a correlation to the occurrence of CJD or Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease in humans. Years ago, there were some cases of Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease, but it normally was only found in elderly people. You thought, well, people past 80 and 90 years of age would have it, but you're not going to have it in the rest of the population. One of the things that began to get people's attention in the Great Britain mad cow thing was the fact that this was hitting younger people. Suddenly, men and women in their 40s were coming down with this, and then what really got someone's attention is when you had teenagers coming down with this. How can this be? It can't be, because this is only the disease of the very elderly. How can it be? That was a question they began to ask, and it really took some soul searching and some people who really fought with this. One person was the one who cracked this thing open in Great Britain, and many people do not care for this one particular man. He's a man who went out on a limb, staked his life and reputation, blew the whistle. He's the one responsible for blowing this whole thing open, and all the British beef industry suffering an economic blow. Recently I found out that it didn't suffer the blow that it was intended that it would get, because they're still keeping most of these animals around and going to use them for food use anyway. What we do understand about the prions is that they are not destroyed by cooking. A prion, well, I used to eat steak, but having come from an Adventist background early in my childhood, I remember hearing about steak not being good for you or meat not being good for you. And so I always, when I would go to the steakhouse, said, I want mine well done. My friends would always say, well, we want it rare so we really get the real taste here. I said, I want mine well done. I don't care what I'm missing. I just might miss some disease in the process. But there's no safety even with this, with the prions, because a prion can survive 300 degrees centigrade for extended periods of time in excess of an hour. What's 300 degrees centigrade? It's high enough to incinerate the entire piece of meat into ash and carbon. And the prion is still there and can still transmit the disease. Absolutely, friends, there is no safety in ingesting these things. Absolutely no safety at all. Some people say, well, I don't eat a whole lot of it, so I probably will be okay. People do win the lottery, and there's very little chance that they will. And people win the Publishers Clearinghouse sweepstakes, and those real people really didn't plan on winning it because they knew there was no chance that they would, or very little chance. There's no safety in meat or milk or cheese or gelatin or eggs. And we'll examine all these things as we go. Gelatin poses a serious threat because there's a lot of gelatin products in food that we don't realize. There's a lot of other things like mono and diglycerides in bread, some of these types of things. Some of the bread makers use a vegetable-sourced mono and diglycerides, and some of them do not. And you're going to have to find out before you want to buy a loaf of bread that says mono and diglycerides on it. Probably the best thing, just make your own bread. But there are some steps that the gelatin makers proclaimed caused their products to be safe. They said, our products are safe because we have reduced the animal product into a pure chemical form, and now it is purely safe. Well, what are some of the forms that we get gelatin in? Of course, Jell-O, jelly beans, gelatin capsules that all of your health food store products all come in. I won't say wealth food stores again, but guess I just did. That was facetious, sorry. Cosmetics. A lot of cosmetics have gelatin-based things in it. There are other things that I probably am not thinking about at the moment. But they had a lot of steps, and they said we have at least 6 steps that will make certain that you have no risk. The first one, they said, is the dilution factor. There are so few sick animals to begin with that the chance of you getting sick from eating something from one of these sick animals is very rare. Well, that doesn't make me feel better at all, because if there's bad luck to be had, it seems like I'm always the one who gets it. If there's a nail out in the middle of the freeway and there's 6 lanes, that's the lane I'm in, and it turns upside like this with a point up just as I pass over it to get in my tire. That just seems to be the way life rolls for me. The next one is they said we inspect all the animals. Well, I know enough about animal inspection to know that few of the animals actually are inspected, and the type of inspection that goes on is a hoax anyway. I had relatives who worked in a meat processing plant, and they told me a little bit about what it was. In fact, I just talked recently to a man who used to be an inspector, and he said, I want to tell you something interesting about where my paycheck came from. I said, it came from the USDA. He said, no, it came from the plant that I was contracted to inspect. I was a USDA inspector, but my check came from the plant that I was inspecting. I said, oh, did that say anything about your loyalties? And he said, I'm not going to comment. And kind of smiled. Other steps. Well, we cut through these things so carefully, and they're so clean, and we take all these precautions and make certain we don't find any bad parts. And these were some of the steps that they used. Another one was they said we grind this stuff all up and run it through an acid bath. Well, that makes me feel better till I find out that prions can survive any acid. They can't survive some of the higher alkaline concentrations, but the acid concentration seems to be no effect to them at all. So, now what are we going to do? Well, we've got to find some other way. They said, oh, by the way, we do heat it. Yeah, about to 160 degrees. I mean, it was really nothing. Some of them may have gone higher since then, I don't know, but the heating ranges were very, very small. Because we know that they can take over 300 degrees Celsius. There's no safety there. The second category that I want to talk about are the retroviruses. We're talking about things like the bovine immunodeficiency virus, which according to the USDA is, we call it the cow AIDS. It's spreading very rapidly in animals. And when you pick up statistics, nobody really knows for sure what the statistics are, because this thing is so rapidly changing. It's such a dynamic situation that you may have a different statistic last month than you have this month. And so you hear somebody talk about something, or you pick up an article and you'll get a number and it won't correlate with somebody else's number because they aren't the same. Some is because we really don't know for sure, because the testing's been a little bit erratic, but other things is it's growing so rapidly we can't keep up with it. Well, what is a retrovirus? A retrovirus is a new type of virus. Typically our old viruses, like cancer viruses, were called oncoviruses. They were a genuine old-fashioned type virus. Your body would recognize one of these viruses taking off, and it would send out your antibodies would form, and your interferon would form, and along come the killer cells, and they'd go and they'd start gobbling them up and throwing them out. Your white count would rise, and then you'd have fought it off, and everything's fine. These new retroviruses can climb into your little body, and they can put on your clothing, so to speak, so that they look like your cells. Your immune system does not recognize them as being invaders. Along comes your little cells, and they say, oh, looks like me, tastes like me, smells like me, must be me, that's fine. They just zoom on around them and looking for something else, and they're totally missing these guys. And so they have the opportunity to take over without being recognized. They're infiltrators. We know a lot about infiltrators today, don't we? Not only do they have this opportunity, they have one other opportunity. They have the opportunity to incorporate themselves into your genetic makeup, to the point that you now are becoming partially viral, and the viral is becoming partially human. Anytime that you want to get rid of this viral epidemic in your body, you will now have to kill the host to get rid of it. That's you. or me or whoever has it. Now, we've heard of people, AIDS isn't a retrovirus. We've heard of people who've gone through a program and now they are no longer HIV positive, they're HIV negative. Well, let's don't start dancing around rejoicing until we understand what this really means. We know now that people can be able to infect others with the AIDS virus at up to 13 months before they have sufficient antibodies to flip positive on an antibody screen. Well, what does that mean? That means someone can have AIDS or at least be HIV positive before they actually show that they're HIV positive. They can infect someone else and not know it, still not even realizing they have the disease themselves. So you take someone, you run them through a good health program, you clean up their blood, you get things into remission, they have no more antibodies in their blood, they say they're HIV negative, I must be cured. Well, just let them go mess up on the 8 laws for a minute, and they'll have it back. And it's very possible that they could still infect someone else during this period. So these people who say that they're curing AIDS, you need to set them straight. Kindly, of course. You know, there are a number of retroviruses that are causing diseases. We have the HIV, the BPV, BLV, and BIV. The BPV, or the bovine papillomavirus, is a disease that's associated with cancerous tumors in cattle. We know that the BPV virus has been isolated out of commercially available milk on grocery store shelves as long ago as 1979. Still virulent after all the processing. Friends, when are Seventh-day Adventists going to wake up? Why are there so few Seventh-day Adventists who are giving these things up? It absolutely boggles my mind. Why will ye die? I have a question for you, and that is, what do young children, dairy farmers, and veterinarians have in common? And the answer is leukemia. It used to be it was people who worked in radioactive environments, people who worked in lab, or not lab, but X-ray, radiologists, people who worked in like the aerospace where they were involved with, possibly some radioactive things. Now it's the young children. Why is it the young children? Because mom makes them drink their milk. That's my hypothesis. Why is it the dairy farmers? Because they're in constant contact with cows who have leukemia. Why is it the veterinarians? Because they're the ones that are called out to treat the sick cows. In the United States, it's been estimated, and I can tell you certainly that these figures are hard to understand because we're getting different figures. The most recent figure I have is that up to 80% of the commercial dairy herd may carry BLV or bovine leukemia virus. That does not mean that they're actively full-blown in this disease. It means that they may be carrying this disease and they may be eventually going to come down with it. The disease can easily be transmitted by the passage or in the ingestion of infected lymphocytes. What are lymphocytes? White blood cells. And since milk is made up largely from white blood cells, aren't you glad you didn't just drink milk for lunch?
Yeah. Is that why it's white?
That's why it's white, I guess. Well, there's a lot of other chemical things in there as well, but that may have a bit to do with it. It's evident to me that I want to avoid this at any and all costs. We know from scientific studies that it is very possible for an infected lymphocyte to cross the intestinal membrane barrier. That means you can drink the milk, has an infected lymphocyte population in it, goes into your digestive tract, and passes through your gut into your blood. Now what happens? Well, it's in you. What are you going to do? Maybe your immune system's going to grab it and shut it down. Maybe it's not. The potential is very realistic that it will not. Some people say, well, I pasteurized it. Well, maybe it didn't kill it. What if it did kill it? Have you ever had a computer and you played around putting floppies in and floppies out? You copied some information onto a floppy and took it out. It's not in the computer anymore. You took it out. There's no electricity around it anymore, no more magnetic fields around it. Did you kill it? No, there's still information on it. Even if you would have killed it, the information's still intact. You know, I can stand on it. The magnetic information is still there. The genetic information of the retrovirus may still be intact even through pasteurization. In fact, we know that there are numerous viruses that survive pasteurization. The foot and mouth disease virus survives pasteurization. Maloney leukemia virus survives pasteurization. Rauscher's leukemia virus and Rous sarcoma virus all have been demonstrated to be able to survive all the way through all the pasteurization processes. It's important that we look to see whether there are any incidences of disease occurring relative to exposure. I look at some of these, we call them cluster cases. Now, some people say, oh, those are not scientific empirical studies. Those are anecdotal. Well, what is anecdotal? It means things that happen that we haven't been able to demonstrate back through a lab again. Well, what if a tree falls in my yard, lands in my car, and squashes it? Is the insurance company going to be able to say that's only anecdotal, it just happened, we can't make it happen 72 out of 100 times in a laboratory? No, I'm going to expect them to pay for my car. I think it happened. Didn't it happen? Sure looked like it to me. Now, we don't always take anecdotal information for gospel, because you know there are some food supplement companies in the industry here that say that, well, we've got so many people here who've taken our product and now they're cured of their cancer or whatever, so this cures cancer. That's what we call an anecdotal suspicion. I could guarantee you that I could take 100 people who have a given disease and make capsules out of sawdust and feed them to them, and X amount of these people would become cured. And then I would get these people to write testimonial letters that my wonderful unknown substance had cured them, and then I could go out and get wealthy by selling more of my sawdust capsules. I mean, there is some element to what's anecdotal and what's scientific. However, these things are beginning to pop up with more and more increasing frequency, and we want to take a look at these and understand that when you talk about increased risk, it is apparent that we're getting increased frequency of disease. In 1968, I mean this is a long time ago, there was a 16-year-old son of a dairy farmer who died with lymphosarcoma. Well, I'm sorry it happens, it's kind of sad. We also discovered that the farmhand had also died of the same disease on the same farm. Well, that's a happenstance. But two neighbors on the nearby farm area had contracted lymphocytic leukemia, relative disease, right within the near area then, that area. And veterinary records showed that this dairy herd on this farm had been plagued with lymphosarcoma for many years. I know it's only anecdotal, but thinking people ought to think. In Elmwood, Wisconsin, we had 7 cases of lymphocytic leukemia in this tiny little town. I've driven through that town on more than one occasion. It's very small. 7 cases of the same disease. Really strange, that many. But you know, it's interesting that in the morning When you drive through that town and the sun would come up, there was a milk manufacturing plant there who manufactured powdered milk, and the milk crystals would frost the trees in the mornings. All these people were breathing and eating this stuff. In Connecticut, 8 members of one family were diagnosed with cancer. Isn't that amazing? 8 members in one household diagnosed with cancer. Veterinary studies showed that there were many verified cases of bovine leukemia virus in that family's dairy herd. Thinking people ought to think. Among veterinarians studied, the rate of cancer were much higher than the general population. Again, people who have increased exposure to these animal diseases. People began to wonder, well, does this have anything to do with like populations of cows and populations of people, etc.? So they did a study and they discovered that definitely the more dairying done in an area, the more cancers and leukemias found in that area. There was no doubt. Again, we said that it's possible that even though the viral particle may have been killed or disabled or lost its life from heating or other processing, it is entirely possible for the genetic information from that particle to be incorporated into the human anatomy. It's estimated that 40% of the herd may be infected, and this is the American herd, of cattle, may be infected with BIV, or the bovine immunodeficiency virus, which is the bovine counterpart of the humanoid AIDS. Doesn't that just really make you hungry for an ice cream cone? Not me. Praise the Lord. I wish I could say I hadn't eaten one for 20 years. We have discovered something increasingly startling, that the bovine immunodeficiency virus and the humanoid immunodeficiency virus have common genetic material. Well, what does that mean? It just means they're related diseases? It also means that we have discovered something called the transactivating gene, or the TAT gene. Well, what is that? The reason this is frightening is because you may have your immune system up pretty well. You have had the AIDS virus come your direction. You've been able to successfully either kill it or weaken it, keep it in submission. It's in your body, but it's under control right now. Your body was astute enough that your immune system caught it and held it, didn't let it take over. And along comes a nice big glass of milk or a nice big piece of cheese, and it's got some of these disease particles in it, and you ingest it, and some of this genetic information is now passing through your membrane of your digestive tract. It's in your blood. Hey, and the two buddies meet. These two cousins have never met before. They've got common genetic material. They have the transactivating gene. The other one can come, and it's like freeze tag, give life to the one who's been frozen. And now you've got AIDS. You would have not had AIDS had you not eaten that material that you knew better than to eat, or that you should have known better than to eat because you're a Seventh-day Adventist who has had the spirit of prophecy at your disposal for your entire lifetime. For those who are new in this faith and who have not heard of the spirit of prophecy until recently, I believe that God has given them a special immunity to this, a special protection. But for those third-generation lifelong members who are still doing what they should have known better than to do, I do not believe that God's hand is resting over them in protection. Better take this one out from underneath. These are sort of a narrative of some actual scientific tests that have been done. Milk from leukemic cows given to 6 chimpanzees, 2 in 9 months were dead with leukemia. They've done the same thing with AIDS. The BIV milk to chimpanzees, and they come down with that pneumocystis carinii, which is the special type of pneumonia that kills AIDS people. Same thing. It's sad, folks. It's really, really sad. You know, this is something that I just wanted to read to you. It's a little bit off the subject here, but it kind of takes us back for just a little bit, and then we'll continue on. It's a letter that I got from someone who's close to me and said, I recently attended the family practice review at the University of Washington. One of the doctors that lectured there talked about antibiotics. He said that this is the first year he can remember that there were no antibiotics out. If I understand him correctly, he was referring to the past year since their last year's meeting. He also talked about the resistant organisms and the need to be careful when we wrote prescriptions. The era of just in case it might help is over. There's a new responsibility for practitioners. Recently, a lady came to see me who had gone to a local doctor for a cold, got a prescription for an antibiotic. A few days later, she had to return to the doctor as she was acutely ill. He sent her to a surgeon who took out over half of her colon. He told her that her antibiotic had killed the good guys in her colon, allowed the bad guys to destroy much of her colon. The surgeon told her that he thought she should run the next time someone wanted to give her an antibiotic. Sorry to get off target. I missed that one in the earlier part when we were talking about antibiotics. Let's talk about how safe raising our own stuff is. You know, all of the hippie mentality we have, we just do it ourselves at home, it's better, right? Well, where are you going to find safe animals to start raising from? Friends, this is 1996, almost 1997. That Councils on Diets and Foods, a quote was from 1902. Talking about the increasing diseases in animals relative to the increasing wickedness and sinfulness in mankind. I tell you, there are no safe animals to start with. I had a friend who really thought that he really could do this, and he was so excited he could raise his own stuff and it was going to be safe and whatever. Unfortunately, he still thinks that in spite of all the information we shared with him. He's chosen to be blind so that he can enjoy what he does. I hope when he has to preach one of his children's funeral I hope that doesn't happen. But there are no disease-free animals that I'm aware of to start raising stock from, and even if there were, we've discovered through scientific testing that the diseases are insect vectored. You can have a healthy cow on your farm. I can have a sick cow on my neighboring farm. Horsefly zooms into my farm, bites my cow, zooms over, bites your cow. We both have it. That's not just a scheme. That's not just an idea. It's been established through testing. Well, we have some people who say, oh, I don't care. I'm just going to go and I'm going to hunt my own animals out of the woods. And see, they have never had anything to do with mankind, and we don't have to worry about that because, they've been out in the boonies and nothing's going to bother them. I mean, they've been eating organic thing from every generation. Man has never had any of their ancestors in captivity. He's never forced disease upon them. They've never been fed animal products. They're disease-free. Well, friends, way back in the 70s, the Fish and Game studies that were conducted found that all species of mammal, fowl, and fish in North America were either disease or parasite laden. That's in the 70s. We're in the late 90s. We're almost out of the 90s. We're almost heading into the year 2000. Where I live, we have mountain lions everywhere, and it's kind of a unique idea. Hey, we got mountain lions. It's pretty neat. It's kind of romantic to have big kitty tracks in your yard. People are walking around with the chills at night when they hear something behind them, or they hear a scratching in the trees. I was out in the woods in the dark one night and I kept hearing this in the trees, and sounds like cat scratch to me. Quick, shine a light on. It's a big buck over there working his antlers on a bush. And heart start beating again. But you know, I guess where I'm headed with this is the conservation authorities like to go out and tag these mountain lions when they're up in the trees. They'll run them down with the dogs and they'll shoot them with a dart gun with a tranquilizer, and they'll bring them down and they'll do blood studies on them. Over 25% of the mountain lions in our area have feline AIDS. What have they ever done to anybody? They're not homosexuals. They don't shoot drugs. How do they get it? It's wickedness. Some people say, well, I still don't believe it. In fact, my brother-in-law was giving this lecture at a cattlemen's meeting, and the cattlemen were quite concerned. In fact, some of them gave up being cattlemen because of that one presentation. But one old fellow stood up and he said, I don't believe it. You're making this all up. I'm going to go shoot an elk and it's going to be as healthy as it's been for the last 60 years. I'm not worried about it. And a lady stood up and she said, I beg your pardon. You know who I am, don't you? And everybody knew she was the wife of the local butcher who processed all of the game. And she said, when you bring your rotten carcasses to me, they are all so full of disease and tumors and parasites that sometimes we don't know what to do to prepare them so that you will take them home and eat them. She said, sometimes these animals are so ridden with little holes in them that we can't find any good meat. And she said, and what do you tell us to do? Grind them up into hamburger and you'll eat them anyway. She said, you know better than that. And everybody in the group had to realize that they did know better. Even the elk are becoming infected with mad cow disease in this continent. So what are we going to do? Well, I'm not going to run out to the supermarket and buy a chicken or an egg, either one, because over the half of the birds in the supermarket are found to be contaminated with salmonella by 60 minutes. And we know that the salmonella is found in the shell now. It's found inside of the egg. Earlier we thought it was because the eggs were dirty, and then we discovered the hens are actually placing it into the embryo before the shell has surrounded it. In fact, they haven't found a chicken or an egg without leukemia virus in it since the 60s. If you could find one, you could go pay off the farm. There's a good reward out by the scientific community. Large financial remuneration for someone who could come up with one of those. Well, I'll tell you what I'm going to do. I'm going to stick to the Genesis 1:29 diet. That's the diet the good Lord put us on when He made us. That's the diet He gave us when He placed Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden. That's the diet that Methuselah made 969 years on. And you look after the flood, when meat became part of the diet, it was only 8 generations and we had dropped down to around 100 years. 8 generations. And men have been piddly, puny sick ever since. I'm going to start raising all the food that I can out of the ground. I want phytochemicals. I don't want to eat phyto food, dog food. I want to eat vegetables and fruits and grains and nuts and sprouts, all of those things. I'm going to read labels, and I'm going to avoid processed foods wherein are hidden many of these things that will cause us to become sick and to die. I'm going to avoid foods like casein, whey, milk fat solids, glycerin, monoindiglyceride, sodium caseinate, and gelatin, which basically means that we're going to make everything at home. We're going to grow our own, and if you're not living in the country, I urge you to get into the country where you can raise your own produce. As genetic engineering in animals has accelerated, so has genetic engineering in plants. And much of the stuff on the supermarket shelf is soon going to be half something else, or part this or part that. We know that these phytochemicals that we talked about in our last program, many of them only are placed into the plant fruit on seed maturation. And if they're picking this stuff green and sending it off to the market so that it'll make it in the truck and not get all battered up and be rotten when it gets there, We just missed an important phase. You know, if you get into the wintertime and you're going to have a tough time raising your food, then get a greenhouse going. They're not expensive to build your own. I mean, you can make a simple one out of some rough lumber and some plastic, if nothing else. If you can't handle that, you can make some window boxes and sprout. You know how much food you can make out of a little sprout farm? Sprouted grains have 6 times the nutrition that a non-sprouted grain has. You want to get 6 times the food power for the same price, then add some free water and some free sunshine to your grain, to your seeds. I think we need to buy the little book Adventist Home. And we need to take the counsel to move out into the country. We need to buy the book Counsels and Diets and Foods and do what the prophet told us. We're told in 2 Chronicles 20:20, if we don't believe the prophet, we won't prosper. If we don't believe the prophet, we won't live and we won't survive. But the converse is also true. If we believe in our prophets, so shall you be established and prosper. Let's bow our heads for a word of prayer. Precious Father, of all the messages that I bear to your people, this is the one that is the most negative sounding to some of them. And I pray that your Spirit will interpret this to their hearts so that they will see that they are soon to die from foolishness that the stubborn, unwilling heart will bring upon them. Lord, you know my heart goes out to people because I didn't want to give up eating these things either. I ask your forgiveness for being a stiff-necked person for so long and giving my wife and family a hard time for trying to do better things than what I was willing to allow to be done in my home. And if there's a man or a woman out there who is bringing death upon their family because of their own hard heart, I pray, Lord, that you'll soften that heart and get through to them. We thank you that you've made all this information available to us, that we can be forewarned and that we can be established and prosper and to be found in that kingdom and amongst the 144,000. In Jesus' name we pray, amen.